I love retro handheld emulation, but a big problem is the names, not just from ANBERNIC, but from every brand really. So now we have three ANBERNIC RG35XX handhelds. We have the original RG35XX, the RG35XX Plus, and now the RG35XX H. So for a lot of people, these can actually be really confusing. So in this video, I'm going to be comparing all three of the RG35XX devices, and I'll try to help you make a better, more informed decision on which one you should buy, or if you're just interested and want to see them all duke it out, playing some N64, and yeah, even the RG35XX can attempt to play some N64 and other higher end consoles, but it's not pretty, to be honest. So we're going to take a peek at all of that in this video, so let's get right to it. So first, we'll start off with the obvious. We have the original RG35XX in a standard Game Boy-like vertical form factor. The RG35XX Plus here in white pretty much looks the exact same, and there are no major design changes whatsoever. There might be a little bit of a different type of plastic used here, but it's not really anything substantial. And then we have the RG35XX H, and the H apparently stands for horizontal, which warrants the horizontal form factor. And if you knew the RG35XX series, you really wouldn't have any clue that the RG35XX H was part of the RG35XX series. And looking at all of these, and depending on if you decide to get the transparent model of each handheld, there will be a little bit different plastic used, but overall all of them have a good build quality and a good feel. Again, there might be some minor differences, but ANBERNIC did a good job on all of these handhelds. They all feel pretty high quality. And before I get further into the video, I'll mention the prices. The RG35XX comes in at about $50, $55 or so. It really depends on where you're buying it. There's a lot of different sales going on. Sometimes you can snag a good deal on AliExpress or a sale on ANBERNIC's website, and at the time of me recording this, it's actually a pretty decent sale going on ANBERNIC right now, so you can get some discounted prices. So I'd expect to pay around $50, $55, maybe upwards of $60 for the RG35XX. And then the RG35XX Plus and the RG35XX H come in at pretty similar prices. After shipping, you should be paying around $70 or so. Again, sometimes it could be a bit more or a bit less depending on the sales, but I'll have some links down below in the description to the official website, as well as the AliExpress store, where sometimes you can get a pretty good deal, and those will be affiliate links. So if you want to support the channel and help me make more videos like these, I'd appreciate it if you use those to buy them if you decide to. So the price differences aren't too large, and for some people might warrant buying the RG35XX Plus or H over the original, but it really depends on which features you want, which we're about ready to get into. So the original RG35XX does not have any Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, but the Plus and the H both come with built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. So if that's important to you, you might be wanting to go for one of those. The original RG35XX comes with a 2600 milliamp hour battery, but then you get 3300 on the Plus and the H. So there is somewhat of an improvement. It's not going to be anything too big. You could still probably expect to get maybe 6-8 hours of gameplay, depending on which consoles you're emulating, your brightness, all kinds of stuff like that. All three of them will come with mini HDMI out, and there's some little quirks, like the RG35XX Plus out of all of them is the only one to have a easily removable battery compartment. And you can look at the H, and it's the only handheld out of all of these three to have two speakers instead of just the one front-facing one that you get on the RG35XX and the Plus. So first, we're going to look at the emulation ability of each of these handhelds, and then after that, we're going to take a look at the controls, which are actually a little bit different for each handheld. So don't just leave after the emulation, because there are some important differences between each of them in terms of controls. So first off, with all low-end emulation, 8-bit, 16-bit era consoles, you're not going to have any problems with any of these three handhelds. Most arcade classics as well will be good on all three, so if you just want something to play some NES, SNES, Game Boy Advance, Genesis, stuff like that, all three of these will have you covered, and maybe you should just go for the cheaper option if that's all you want. And once we get up to the PlayStation 1, that's where some differences start to be more obvious. So I'll say one thing before I proceed here. The RG35XX Plus and the RG35XX H actually have the exact same internal specs, so their ability to emulate games are going to be the exact same. Of course, there are differences, like on the H you have analog sticks and you don't on the Plus, but just keep in mind there's really only two options when it comes to this emulation. There's the original RG35XX, and then there's the Plus and the H, which are going to perform the exact same. So don't go looking for differences between the two, because they're going to be the same. So back to the PlayStation 1, the original RG35XX is going to be able to play pretty much every single PlayStation 1 game well. I can't think of a time on my RG35XX I've ever experienced any slowdown. Even playing some of the harder to run PS1 games, the RG35XX handles it well. But on the RG35XX Plus and H, you're going to be able to play a lot of PlayStation 1 at 2x resolution, which you're not really able to do on the original RG35XX. You can play maybe some really lower-end games on 2x resolution on the original, but for a lot of games, you're going to encounter pretty frequent slowdown. But that's not the case with the Plus and the H. With these two handhelds, you can handle a lot of PlayStation 1 at a 2x resolution, so if that's something you care about a lot, I would say don't really attempt it on the original, and you should probably take more of a look at the Plus and the H. So I would say the original RG35XX is good for the PlayStation 1, but the Plus and the H are better for the PlayStation 1. Once we get into even more difficult emulations, such as the N64, that's where the original RG35XX begins to tap out. So on the original RG35XX, it doesn't even come with any N64 ROMs or an emulator on the stock firmware, so you actually need to download custom firmware, one called Kuriki, to be able to play N64 games and many of the others that we're about ready to mention. And if you do decide to do so, you'll discover that the N64 performance isn't super great. You might be able to handle some easier to run games, sure, but when it comes to most N64 games, it's not going to be super great, and there are some other problems with emulation on Kuriki for other consoles, so you might have to have a second microSD card with Kuriki on it and then use your other preferred OS on another one, so it's not super convenient. But on the RG35XX Plus and the RG35XX H, I would say most N64 games will actually be able to be played on here, especially if you go into the settings and do a few tweaks, which will just take you about a minute. You'll be able to play most N64 games with some occasional slowdown, and in some of the really hard to run games, they're not going to be super great. So I wouldn't say either the H or the Plus have mastered the N64, but a really good amount of N64 games you can play. And I would say the same thing for the Dreamcast as well. Dreamcast is going to be even worse on the RG35XX. Again, with Kuriki, you can play some games on the RG35XX. Maybe some super easy to run platformer games or something might be able to be played. The very, very easiest stuff. I haven't tested any of that out personally, but pretty much everything does not seem to work very well at all on the original RG35XX when it comes to Dreamcast. So I would say don't even attempt it. It's not going to be good. But on the Plus and the H, a lot of Dreamcast games actually will run pretty good. Of course, you might need some frame skip, but I would say a decent percent, probably the majority of Dreamcast games will be playable on the RG35XX Plus and the RG35XX H. And over to the Nintendo DS, so with custom firmware, the RG35XX can play some DS games. It's not going to be perfect for every game, but I would say for some lighter games, you're actually going to be able to get pretty good performance. And then over on the Plus and the H, these are able to handle pretty much any DS game you can throw at it. Of course, there's going to be some outliers, not because they're not powerful enough, really just because there's no touchscreen, and certain DS games are just impossible to play without a touchscreen. And there's also PSP, so the PSP isn't going to be really playable at all on the original RG35XX. Again, with custom firmware, technically you can play some PSP games. The absolute easiest to run puzzle games or maybe some platformers might be able to be playable on it, but all the iconic PSP games that we know and love aren't going to be able to be played on here at all. And then on the Plus and the H, you're going to be able to get pretty good performance on a decent amount of PSP games. The harder to run games aren't going to be super great, but a decent amount of them will actually run very well. Like this Ridge Racer game you can see here is somewhat demanding, and you might experience the occasional slowdown at certain points on the track. Well, it would be awesome if something like the RG35XX H was a perfect PSP replacement. It really isn't. There's still quite a few games that are just unplayable on this, and again on the Plus as well because they have the same specs, but quite a few easy to run and mid-tier PSP games will run very well on these two handhelds. And now let's take a quick look at the controls because there are differences between all of them like I said earlier. I don't want anyone to be confused and think just because the RG35XX Plus and the RG35XX H have the same internal specs, there's no differences between the controls other than the analog sticks obviously, because there are some important differences. First we have our A, B, X, Y buttons. They pretty much all feel the same on each handheld. There might be a small difference between the RG35XX and the RG35XX Plus and H, but overall they feel really good. There is a different look to the H and the Plus, but it doesn't really make any difference whatsoever. And then we have our shoulder buttons, which are actually all different between each handheld. On the RG35XX we have our standard inline shoulder buttons. which are fine. They're pretty clicky, they're somewhat loud, but not too bad. And then on the RG35XX Plus, we have the same inline shoulder buttons, but they're actually sloped a bit, which make them very, very comfortable, and I think it's a great improvement from the original RG35XX. Not like they're so uncomfortable they're unplayable or something, but it's just a nice luxury to have and actually feel really nice. So I think that's a great improvement. They basically feel and sound the same as the original RG35XX. And then on the RG35XX H, we have them on the top of the handheld. They're in line. It would be nice if they were stacked, but I understand why they did it. It's a small, compact device. It'd make it less pocketable. They're fairly small. For certain games, I could see it being a little bit difficult sometimes to reach over to the R2 button or the L2 button, but I like the fact that they're up top to make it a small, pocketable device. And then we have the D-pads. So the D-pads are a little bit different on each handheld. So we're going to start off with the original RG35XX. So the RG35XX D-pad is pretty good. It could be a lot better. There have always been some complaints about it. I would say the major complaint has always been accidental diagonals. In most of the games that I play, even in a lot of platformers, it doesn't really matter and I didn't notice it whatsoever. But if that's something that bothers you, this D-pad is a little bit more likely to give you accidental diagonals on occasion. As you can see here, pressing down on the D-pad and then quickly rocking it back and forth, on pretty much every D-pad you should expect to see some diagonals, but there is a point where it's too much and is indicative of having annoying bad performance in games where you don't want to be doing diagonals but you are, and that could be a problem on the RG35XX, but honestly I don't really want to oversell the issue. I think for most users, for most games, it's going to be a non-issue and a lot of people just wouldn't notice it at all, but if that's something that you care about and does bother you, you should keep that in mind. And then on the RG35XX Plus, you actually get a slightly softer feeling D-pad compared to the original RG35XX, which some people said was a bit sharp feeling. I didn't really notice that too much, but I'm pretty sure I heard multiple people complain about that, so I guess it is a thing. So you get a softer feeling D-pad, and the accidental diagonal problem has actually really been fixed. You can see there are some diagonals here, but that's to be expected, and I think it's a really good D-pad. So then moving over to the RG35XX H, we do have that same nice soft feeling D-pad, but with the RG35XX H, you do actually get some more accidental diagonals than you do on the Plus, so there was a bit of regression there. Again, I think for a lot of people, myself included really, for most games, it's a non-issue, but I know a lot of people play certain platformers and other games where that is more of a consideration. You'll have to decide if that's something that's more important to you or you don't really care. Again, I think most people wouldn't really notice it. Probably if no one else pointed it out to me, I never actually would have noticed it myself. Then of course on the H, we also have here two analog sticks, which really feel nice. They're not Hall sticks or anything, but I'd say they're about what you'd normally expect for a cheaper retro handheld. I think they get the job done, and especially if you want to do a lot of N64 or Dreamcast or even some PSP emulation, sure, you can get the job done on most games with a D-pad on the Plus, for example, but still, these analog sticks are a nice addition. There's also some minor differences, like I mentioned, having dual speakers on the RG35XX H, and the RG35XX H also has two USB-C ports instead of just one on the other two handhelds. So there are some small differences here and there. They all have the same 3.5-inch screen, but there might be some minor differences between them in terms of brightness, but really all this is very small and not super noticeable. And when it comes to the screen stuff, it actually can change depending on which OS you're using, so you have to keep all that in mind as well. And speaking of the OS, I'll mention right here, a lot of people aren't in love with the stock ANBERNIC OS, which actually did recently get an upgrade and looks a little bit nicer than it used to, but still, a lot of people aren't super happy with its functionality. On the original RG35XX, I already mentioned creaky, but there are also a lot of other really great popular custom firmware options, most notably Garlic OS, which provides a lot of functionality and a really nice looking interface. So if you're interested in custom firmware, you should check that out on the original RG35XX. But when it comes to the RG35XX Plus and the RG35XX H, which are pretty much going to be getting the same custom firmware options because the specs are the exact same, the custom firmware scene isn't super great right now. There is Garlic 2.0 available, but as of me recording this video, and of course in the future that's going to change, it's not fully developed, and there is creaky available as well for the RG35XX Plus and H, I believe. There's still improvements to be made, obviously, because the Plus and the H are much more recent than the original RG35XX. There's a lot of tweaks being done, so I'll leave this to you to research because this all evolves with time, and I don't want to have some irrelevant information in the video that's going to change 3 months down the line. design. So which one is the best? Which one do I recommend? Honestly, I can't really say I recommend one. So if you just want something to play your favorite Pokemon games from the Game Boy Advance and you don't really have any aspirations of playing N64 or Dreamcast or whatever, I would say yeah, just go for the original RG35XX if you're sure you don't need more power. So if you think you might want to play something like Dreamcast or N64 or want to use the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth at some point in the future, I would say the upgrade isn't too much more expensive, so maybe it is worth it just to future-proof it. Decide in the future you want something more, it might be worth considering buying the Plus or the H. And then between the Plus and the H, of course you do have the analog sticks, which is nice for Dreamcast and N64 on the H. But you might not like that horizontal design, and you want something that looks more like a Game Boy like the RG35XX Plus. I know for me, I prefer the vertical design, but the analog sticks are nice, so it's kind of a tough thing, and it's always been a little more uncomfortable and tough to fit 2 analog sticks on a vertical device. It has been done, but I think it's more comfortable on a horizontal form factor. So really, you know what you want out of a handheld, and I'll leave that up to you. So if you do decide to buy one, I'd really appreciate it if you use my links down below in the description. There'll be affiliate links. They help support my channel and make it possible to make more review videos like these. So I'll have links down below to the official ANBERNIC store as well as AliExpress if you like buying through there. Sometimes there's different sales and you can get a better deal on AliExpress or vice versa. So if you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.